The stage was set for a night of laughs and light-hearted banter, but what unfolded on Jimmy Kimmel's late-night show became anything but that. The moment Sylvester Stallone walked onto the stage, something in the air shifted. The audience cheered with enthusiasm, but Stallone's expression was colder than expected, his trademark stoicism even sharper than usual. As he sat down, Jimmy leaned into his usual charm, trying to ease the atmosphere with a few jabs and playful references to Stallone's legacy in action films. But the tone misfired, and Stallone's eyes didn't flinch. They narrowed. The first, uncomfortable shift came when Jimmy joked about how many punches Stallone must have faked in his career. The crowd chuckled, but Stallone didn't. Instead, he crossed his arms and stared at the host with the kind of glare that could have stopped a freight train. That silence, barely 10 seconds long, was heavier than any monologue Jimmy had ever delivered. When he laughed nervously and tried to move on, Stallone finally spoke, and his voice wasn't amused. He questioned whether Jimmy had ever respected the work actors like him put into their careers. The tone was not teasing, it was confrontational. Jimmy, caught off guard, still tried to spin it into comedy, but this only pushed Stallone further. The tension grew with every word, and the energy in the studio shifted. The audience, unsure if they were witnessing a scripted bit or a real argument unfolding, became eerily quiet. Jimmy then made an offhanded remark about actors clinging to past glory, a reference clearly aimed at Stallone's iconic roles. That was the match thrown onto gasoline. Stallone leaned forward, his face tightening with fury. His voice, low but unmistakably threatening, carried through the room like a hammer on glass. He made it clear that his work was more than just nostalgia, more than punchlines for late-night hosts to toss around for a cheap laugh. What began as awkwardness had now turned into visible hostility. Jimmy tried to reel it back, but the damage was done. The room was no longer a talk show, it was a battleground. Then Stallone asked why someone who had never stepped foot on a film set with dirt under his nails felt qualified to ridicule a man who had written, directed, and acted in his own stories. The audience shifted uncomfortably, the band silent, unsure whether to step in or remain frozen. Kimmel, in rare form, dropped his smile completely and leaned forward. He accused Stallone of being too sensitive, too proud to take a joke. And for the first time that night, the gloves came off on both sides. Sylvester's jaw tensed. His next words weren't loud, but they cut deep. He began to dissect everything he believed was wrong with the modern entertainment world and, in no uncertain terms, told Jimmy that he represented all of it. Fake laughs, safe jabs, performative sincerity. Jimmy, now visibly offended, snapped back, claiming that the only thing fading faster than Stallone's patience was his relevance. That was it. The crowd gasped. The insult struck a nerve. Stallone straightened his back like a fighter rising in the ring. The lighting no longer felt like part of a set. The cameras didn't seem to belong there. What followed was not playful tension but something much more personal. It was no longer about jokes or careers. It was about pride, respect, and the deep bitterness that sometimes hides behind aging smiles in Hollywood. And just like that, the temperature in the room reached its boiling point. Jimmy's attempt to smooth over the damage with a half-hearted joke landed flat, as lifeless as the silence that followed. Stallone didn't budge. He stood with his arms at his sides, his face carved with decades of battles fought both on screen and off. The tension between them wasn't just visible now, it was suffocating. The audience sat on the edge of their seats, unsure whether they were watching a moment of collapse or rebirth. Jimmy, realizing his comedic timing had completely abandoned him, straightened up and tried to reclaim authority. He asked Stallone to sit back down, saying they still had a show to finish. But Stallone refused. Not out of defiance, but because, for him, the show was already over. What he had come to promote didn't matter anymore. What mattered now was the truth that had been bubbling beneath the surface for years. about the entertainment industry, about respect, about legacy. Stallone took a breath and turned to the audience, not to lecture them, but to confront the larger issue at hand. He spoke about how easily entertainers like Jimmy thrived off mocking people's work, while hiding behind sarcasm and applause signs. He talked about the cost of longevity in Hollywood, the toll it took on a man to stay relevant, without selling out, and then his words sharpened. He called Jimmy a man who profited from tearing down others to build his own platform. That accusation rattled Jimmy. His eyes darted toward the cameras, toward the audience, toward his crew, but no one came to his rescue. No laughter cue, no band distraction, nothing to cover for the humiliation now crawling up his spine. He tried to strike back, claiming Stallone was out of touch, unable to accept humor at his own expense. But Stallone responded with something colder than anger. He asked Jimmy if he ever laughed when the jokes were about his family. The question was sharp and deliberate. It landed like a punch. The air got heavier. Jimmy froze. The crowd didn't know whether to gasp or stay silent, but their collective breath was held. Stallone didn't elaborate. He didn't have to. The suggestion that Jimmy wouldn't tolerate even a fraction of the mockery he dished out every night was enough to leave the host cornered. For a moment it looked like Jimmy would lash out. His face turned red, his jaw clenched, and he leaned forward, ready to deliver a biting retort. But nothing came. He sat back slowly, his hands gripping the edge of the desk, trying to maintain control of a situation that had completely slipped from his grasp. And then Stallone delivered what felt like a final blow. Not with cruelty, but with clarity. He said that true entertainers build bridges between people, that they don't take shortcuts by mocking those who paved the way. He reminded Jimmy that comedy without compassion was just cruelty dressed as charm. The crowd erupted, not in laughter, not in shock, but in slow, uncertain applause that started at the edges of the room and grew louder, more supportive, like people realizing what they were witnessing wasn't a meltdown, but a reckoning. Jimmy looked out at his audience, at the very people who had always been on his side, and for the first time they weren't laughing with him. They were listening to someone else, someone who wasn't afraid to speak without filter or polish. Someone who wasn't trying to be liked, only to be honest. The power in the room had shifted. The applause that rolled through the studio didn't sound like the usual manufactured cheer that followed Jimmy's punchlines. It was genuine, grounded, and almost uncomfortable in its honesty. Jimmy's fingers tapped nervously against his desk as he forced a smile, but it didn't touch his eyes. Stallone remained standing, not in defiance, but in calm composure, his arms crossed now, not to guard himself, but to measure the room's energy. He had said what he came to say, and it had struck deeper than even he anticipated. Jimmy tried, once more, to shift the moment back to humor. He fumbled through a cue card, trying to find something, anything, to change the subject. But every attempt at a joke only widened the gulf between them. Stallone had already cracked through the late night illusion. The crowd wasn't buying the act anymore. They didn't want deflection. They wanted resolution. Still, Jimmy refused to bow. His pride was on full display. He accused Stallone of hijacking the show, of using his appearance not to promote anything, but to rant. He called him bitter, said he was playing the victim. That finally made Stallone step forward. His eyes narrowed, his face unreadable, and the room froze once again. But his voice didn't rise. It softened, and that made it even more piercing. He explained he wasn't there to play the victim. He was there because men like Jimmy had turned real struggle into satire. He talked about being homeless when he first came to Hollywood, about selling his dog to pay rent, about begging for one chance to prove himself. These weren't stories Stallone told for sympathy. He told them to remind people that behind the icon was a man who had lost, scraped, and bled for everything he had. Jimmy, clearly shaken, leaned back as if trying to put distance between himself and the truth he didn't want to face. He said Stallone had become too sensitive, too serious, too outdated for modern audiences. That's when Stallone stepped closer again. Not threatening, but commanding. He told Jimmy that being outdated wasn't a failure. It meant you had lasted, that you didn't fold with every trend, didn't bend every time the wind changed. The camera zoomed in slightly, capturing the weight on Jimmy's face. His sarcasm had deserted him. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't the one holding the spotlight. He was in it, and not by choice. Stallone stood over him, not to belittle, but to illuminate. He asked Jimmy when was the last time he risked something on his show that wasn't pre-approved by focus groups or production notes. When was the last time he said something that mattered? That question didn't need an answer. The silence was won. Suddenly, a voice from the audience broke the tension. Not laughter, but someone saying they respected Stallone. Then another voice. Then applause again. Stallone didn't bask in it. He simply nodded, then turned his attention back to Jimmy. The host looked visibly smaller now, like the show itself had grown too big for the desk he once controlled with ease. But this wasn't about destroying Jimmy. Stallone had no interest in humiliation. What he wanted, what he demanded, was respect. Not for himself alone, but for every artist who came before, and everyone still trying to break through without being mocked for not fitting into the mold of what was deemed entertaining by the late-night world. And in that moment, Jimmy saw it. His jokes had finally hit someone who wouldn't smile and shake it off. Someone who wouldn't pretend the disrespect didn't cut deep. Stallone was a man who had survived Hollywood's coldest winters, and he didn't come to Jimmy's show for laughs. He came with a mirror, and Kimmel was finally being forced to look into it. There was no script left to follow. The teleprompter, the note cards, the canned transitions, they all meant nothing now. Jimmy sat there visibly shaken, still trying to process the fact that the guest he invited for laughs had completely unraveled the stage he controlled. And Stallone stood tall, not gloating, not victorious in the petty sense, but simply present, immovable, like a man who had said everything he needed to say and could leave with his conscience clear. The tension had shifted into reflection. Jimmy leaned back in his chair, no longer trying to force jokes or pivot the narrative. He looked at Stallone and, for the first time without performance, there was no camera wink, no fake humility, just a man confronted with the reality that he'd crossed a line, and the audience had watched him do it. The crowd, unsure whether to applaud or remain silent, eventually offered a standing ovation. Not for a joke, not for a staged moment, but for truth. Something rare on television. Something raw. Stallone didn't react. He didn't smile, didn't bow. He waited, silently, until the noise faded again, until the studio settled into a low, thoughtful hum. Jimmy finally spoke, but this time with none of the sharpness from before. He admitted, in fewer words than usual, that perhaps the line between comedy and cruelty had been walked too carelessly. It wasn't an apology, not yet, but it was a beginning. A crack in the wall he had built around his show. A glimpse of humility. Behind the polished host, Stallone accepted it not with words, but with a slow, thoughtful nod. That was all it took. He stepped back from the desk, preparing to leave, not needing any wrap-up segment or promotional line. The interview was never about a film or a project. It had become something far more meaningful. A confrontation with a culture that rewards mockery over meaning. Before exiting the stage, Stallone paused and turned back one final time. Not to gloat, not to threaten, but to deliver a closing truth that would echo long after the credits rolled. He told the room that a legacy isn't something you preserve by clinging to old titles. It's something you defend when it's being eroded by cynicism, even if you have to do it alone, in front of the entire world. Jimmy said nothing. There were no jokes left. He sat still, processing the confrontation not as a host, but as a man who had finally been forced to reckon with the impact of his words. It wasn't a loss, but a lesson, and a loud one. Stallone left the studio without security, without handlers, just his stride and the silence of a room that had never seen anything like it. Outside, the press was waiting. They shouted questions, hungry for headlines, but he didn't stop. He didn't need to explain what had just happened. The world had seen it. The clips would go viral. The internet would debate for days, but at the heart of it all would remain one undeniable fact. Sylvester Stallone didn't just walk into a studio that night. He walked into the lion's den and walked out untouched, his dignity intact, and his legacy sharper than ever. And Jimmy Kimmel, once the king of late-night smirks, had been left staring at a reflection that didn't laugh back. Stallone's eyes locked on Jimmy's, unblinking. What had started as a disagreement had now devolved into an all-out verbal standoff. The audience no longer clapped, no longer laughed, not even nervously. The cameras kept rolling, but the show had slipped out of anyone's control. What people were witnessing wasn't just a celebrity confrontation. It was decades of unspoken resentment erupting in real time. Stallone leaned in, slow and deliberate, and asked Kimmel if he truly understood what it took to claw your way into the industry without a family name or corporate backing. He reminded the host, not for applause but for accountability, that when the door had been shut in his face hundreds of times, he wrote his own door into existence. Kimmel looked away for a second, then back, but the momentary glance downward hadn't gone unnoticed. The crowd could sense the weight of Stallone's words, but Jimmy, ever the performer, didn't back down. He scoffed, implying Stallone's bitterness stemmed from being a relic of another era. He compared Stallone's dedication to a man polishing trophies in an empty room. That comment hit Stallone like a slap, not because it was clever, but because it stripped away every ounce of dignity from a man who had bled for his legacy. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then Stallone stood up. He didn't shout. He didn't throw a chair or slam his fist. He simply rose from the couch, his frame towering above the host's desk. His expression wasn't wild, it was composed, but composed in the way a storm is just before it breaks. He stared down at Jimmy, and the heat in the studio turned unbearable. Then, for the first time in the confrontation, Stallone brought the personal into it. He asked Jimmy how many people he had helped rise through the industry, how many scripts he had fought to keep pure, how many young actors had ever called him a mentor. He asked it without bragging, but with the kind of weight only a man who had lived through rejection, humiliation, and loss could deliver. Jimmy didn't answer. He laughed. A dry, defensive laugh that only made the tension worse. Then Jimmy threw the final spark onto the flames. He said that Stallone's relevance came not from who he was, but from who he used to be. That the real reason Stallone was so angry was because he could feel the world moving on without him. That comment wasn't just insulting, it was cruel. And Stallone's response was nothing short of thunder. He stepped around the desk, not with aggression, but with precision. A veteran stepping into a war he didn't start, but knew how to finish. He stood directly in front of Jimmy and told him that some people build things, and some people tear them down for laughs. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The raw emotion in his words spoke louder than any outburst. At that point, the crew backstage began to stir, unsure whether to intervene. The band stayed quiet. Producers whispered to each other, heads ducked behind the curtains, and yet no one moved. No one dared break the moment. The world was watching two men, one who had built his name with blood and grit, and another who had climbed through charisma and timing, now face to face with every bit of tension their careers had been holding back. Jimmy, sensing he had gone too far, tried to reel the conversation back to humor. He tried to laugh it off, offer a closing joke, something to end the tension without admitting defeat. But Stallone wasn't interested in moving on. He wasn't there for entertainment anymore. He was there for truth. And he had more to say.